Hi everyone, here is a closer look at some more trends in marriage and family. A lot of our assignments this week are pretty narrowly focused on same-sex marriage and family dynamics, so I wanted this to give you a better look at some more things that are going on in marriage and family as well. First up, we have marriage markets. So all of the research I'm going to be showing you today is from the Pew Research Center. The link to that will go up in the announcements on Friday. But they do a lot of research on marriage and family topics in the U.S. So on page 236 of your book, it talks about this entire concept of marriage market. And that's where having this open dating system helps you compare partners and find the best mate. Recently, the research has been on, well, where are the best odds of that marriage market working out for you? And so what these maps show are the metro areas that have the highest number of employed single men to single women. And the Pew Foundation found that increasingly that's something women are really interested in, that they're hoping to find men with jobs. So if that is what you're looking for, some of the areas where that is most likely are San Jose, California, Denver, Colorado, San Diego, California, Minneapolis, Seattle, San Francisco, DC, Los Angeles, Pittsburgh, and Orlando. It's interesting to think about what characteristics those might have in common. Are those booming economic markets? Many of these are places where there's also pretty high employment in general. What is it where maybe there'd be a higher proportion of employed single men? You know, what are the industries there? For example, San Jose and San Francisco both have pretty busy tech centers that tend to statistically employ more men. Something that's interesting to look at, because Rexburg is not a large city and they look at large cities, we don't have statistical data for them, but we do have Provo-Orem and Salt Lake, which show some similar trends and sort of more Mormon-specific trends. What we find there is that both of those areas have more men than women, but about even numbers of employed men and women, so that's an interesting trend. And that the worst areas, if you're looking for this, are the areas of the country that already have high proportions of poverty. So if you look at the tan on this map, you'll notice a lot of it goes over anything we've talked about with poverty, whether it's in the South or in the Rust Belt or on like an Indian reservation, that those are marriage markets that are going to be harder if you are a single woman trying to find a single young man with a job. Let's also look at this in the reverse. So for men who are looking for employed women, now this is lower overall, as we talked about in our week on gender and work, that women do tend to cluster in different occupations, or they're more likely to be taking breaks out of the workforce to care for their children. So the overall numbers of employed women to men are lower to start with. But yeah, they're very different areas. There's Lewiston, Maine, Racine, Wisconsin, Greenville, North Carolina, Jacksonville, Alabama, and Wausau, Wisconsin. And we can see that trend pretty directly here in Utah, that Salt Lake has 67 employed women for 100 men, and Provo has 57 employed women per 100 men. Marriage market really, when we talk about topics in sociology, very few of them are completely isolated on their own. And here we can see where marriage and behaviors that influence marriage and dating are also really strongly tied to gender and work and other topics that we'll also be discussing for sociology. All right, one trend that is major in terms of marriage and family in America is divorce and remarriage. So this was, I thought, really interesting. In 2013, 40% of all marriages include at least one spouse who's been previously married, and 20% of marriages have both of the spouses where they've had a previous marriage. So that's this increasing trend that not just is divorce a rising trend, but people also then getting remarried and having a blended family is also a rising trend that's pretty significant to look at sociologically. Something else that I think is interesting there is it talks about this graph here on the right shows that that's more likely for men. So women are more likely, 45% of their respondents said they didn't want to get remarried, whereas only 30% of men did. And that men who said yes or not sure, you're looking at about 65%, whereas women, it's only 52%, or sorry, let's add that correctly. 42%. So that's really interesting that you have these very different percentages when it comes to men and women remarrying, that men are more likely to do that, and that remarriage has just become more likely, well, partly because of the rise in divorce, but they also pointed out it's because the population is generally aging, that people are living longer, so there's more time possibly after you are widowed or also divorced that you'd be willing to take on a second marriage. So for example, if the average lifespan is only 50 or 60 and you either are widowed or divorced at 40, you might think, oh, well, it's not that long. But if you're widowed or divorced at 40 and you think you're going to live to be 85 or 90, you're a lot more likely to get remarried. Other trends that I think are pretty interesting to look at, especially as students, is that the overall trend for marriage and youth has been a delay. And your book talks about how the age at marriage has gone up to about 27 and 29. That's 27 for women and 29 for men. That is not the same average age as BYU Idaho students, clearly, but the trend for Mormons has also been a delay as well, just not to quite the same overall level. There's a few interesting graphs here that I really like to show. So this shows your percent married between the ages of 18 to 32 by generation. So for millennials, there's only 26% that are married between 18 and 32, compared to people one generation younger, or one generation older, which was 36%, and that's declined just generation by generation. So people are pushing that back later and later. Something else that's interesting is that this varies by race. So this line chart at the bottom shows percentages of adults who've never been married. You have the highest would be blacks with 36% never married, and then 26% of Hispanics, 19% of Asians, and 16% of whites. It's always interesting to see that kind of variation. And then this is really interesting, I think, is that education has more notably become a trend. So there's a lot of lines in that, but the basic trend is that in 2012, the number for less than high school graduation is 23.4 per 1,000, and then it goes up little by little, but if it's a bachelor's degree or more, it goes all the way up to 56.7. So increasingly, a higher amount of education is becoming associated with whether or not you'll get married. That's really interesting. And then the last topic I want to look at, marriage and family, is so broad. There's so many topics you can look at, but the last one we're just going to look at is parenting and how your parenting might change based on a few characteristics about you. First up, the Pew Research Center looked at parenting and political ideology. So they asked people if they saw themselves as consistently liberal, mixed, mostly conservative, or consistently conservative. And then they also asked parents what their priorities were in teaching children. So if it's in the dark yellow, they said it was most important, and then the top thing is overall, where someone said it was important of some sort. So things that I think are really interesting is that 81% of consistently conservative parents said religious faith was important, compared to 26% of consistently liberal. That trend gets flipped a bit when you talk about tolerance, where consistently liberal parents, that was 88% compared to 41% of consistently conservative. And then obedience was also different, from 35% on the consistently liberal end, 67% on the consistently conservative side. What I did think is interesting, though, is that most values really were consistent across political ideology, that they all valued about equally responsibility, hard work, manners, helping others, independence, and persistence. You can see some little changes here and there, but basically everybody thought that those were really important. There were a few other trends in this parenting study. They found a few gender differences, education level differences, and racial differences. There's a lot of information here, so I'll just highlight a couple that were really notably different. One was that women thought empathy was more important in general than male parents did, that male parents were more likely to emphasize teaching their children persistence and creativity compared to their wives. So that's interesting, just to see how different genders view what they should teach their children. Education level was interesting also. You can see a few things where high school or lower valued. Some of those things were obedience or also manners or helping others. Those all showed up. Religious faith also actually showed up more for people with overall lower education. And then college graduates tended, the most sort of statistically significant areas where they were different were a much higher focus on things like empathy and persistence. So it's just really interesting to see how even your education level can change what you teach your children. And then race, I actually think these are most notable for overall really being pretty similar. There's a few differences. One was that the black families in the sample had a higher percentage of parents saying it was important to teach their children religious faith and then also obedience. And then white and Hispanic families tended to be really pretty similar on these. Some areas that were different were that white families tended to put empathy as more important than other groups. But overall, there was a lot of similarities here. So yeah, there's a lot of topics you can look at with marriage and family. I hope one of these is something that's interesting to you and just gives you a broader picture of sociological research on these topics. Thanks.